Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming and braving this nice rain that we're getting, timely rain. Today, I have to go through this. Yeah, thank you. Today we are really fortunate that one of our postdocs that has been with us for the past 3 months now has been able to start giving us some of his a presentation of some of his work. And it's a very timely topic and very relevant to our part of the world. It's politics, and we love politics, and it's water, and we all are seeking water, and power relations, and we've been experiencing power relations par excellence here. I mean, in everything but water. So we are bringing all this together and presenting it to you, and taking it a step further, organizing thoughts as to how we are and we ought to be approaching that water topic, not from a technical perspective, but from a political and social perspective. So I will not take much. I will introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Hussam Hussein. He is an Arab Council for Social Sciences postdoc research fellow here at the Assam Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the Climate Change and Environment Program. Dr. Hussein is also a visiting fellow at the University of East Anglia, where he obtained his PhD degree, and he worked with one of the key figures in water and water politics, Mark Zaytoun. Hussam's PhD thesis focused on water scarcity discourses and transboundary water governance in Jordan. And prior to getting his PhD, he had worked at University of Trieste in Italy, in College of Europe, this School of Overseas and African Studies, and finally at the University of East Anglia. He has worked also for the European Parliament, the Italian Embassy in Amman, and the NGO EcoPeace, the London Middle East Institute, and also for the World Bank. So he's got a very wide range of experience, and he's recently been involved in a couple of courses on hydrodiplomacy in the Middle East here, one in Alexandria and the other one in Cairo. So, and also he very recently presented at a conference on scarcity, water scarcity in the Middle East in Irbid.
One in Irbid and one in Yemen. Yeah.
Okay, and also he was involved in a conference in Vienna on European approach to water and water politics. So with this introduction, I turn it over to Hussam, and please, if I may ask you to turn off your phones, at least so that they won't ring, and we'll leave questions, if you don't mind, unless it's really pressing and you cannot stop yourself. Leave questions until after the presentation. Thank you, Hussam.
Great. Thank you, Nadim, for the very nice and kind words. And thank you, everyone, for coming today, even if it's raining, but you decided to challenge the rain and come to this presentation. So thank you very much for being here and for your interest in the topic. So as Nadim mentioned, the presentation is going to be on water politics and water scarcity in the Middle East. And I'm going to unpack the power relations, interests, and discourses. Probably many of you are not very familiar with water politics, and therefore at the beginning I'm going to look at some basic concepts of water politics and hydropolitics, explaining what hydropolitics and water politics are. Then I'm going to be looking at water wars and peace with water, virtual water, critical hydropolitics, so transboundary water interaction nexus, some principles of international water law, and the hydrohegemony framework. So this part focuses mainly on introducing some basic concepts of water politics. And the second part focuses on the water scarcity discourse. So I will present the case of Jordan, and in particular water scarcity in Jordan, to analyze and unpack the discourse, power relations, and interest. Great. So what is water politics? When I usually ask this question to my students, they mention dams, they mention agreements, negotiations, but I also mention privatization of water resources. So water politics can include many different things. However, I look at hydropolitics or water politics from an international relations perspective. And therefore, the generally accepted definition of hydropolitics is the systematic study of conflict and cooperation between states over water resources that transcend international borders. And with this, I mean basically looking at rivers, so freshwater resources, rivers or lakes, but mainly rivers, also groundwater resources, meaning aquifers. They are shared by more than one country, so at least two countries, to understand the conflictual and cooperative relations between countries over these shared water resources. So, for instance, we can think of the Nile River, which crosses 11 countries, or the Jordan River, or other rivers, to understand who gets the water, how, and why. So, water wars. Probably you all heard of water wars in the past years and decades. Many mass media, some scholars mentioned water wars, seeing it as the blue oil of the 21st century and believing that in the 21st century wars would be fought over water resources. In particular, in the case of scarce regions, water scarce regions, such as the Middle East. Many declarations of high-level politicians, for instance, you can see in these slides, for instance, King Hussein of Jordan mentioned that water as the only reason that might lead Jordan to war with Israel. Boutros Ghali, also the United Nations, mentioned water as and water wars as possibly being the reason for wars, especially in the Middle East and water-scarce countries and regions of the 21st century. And Homer Dixon is one of the academics that led this discussion on water wars in academia, seeing scarcity of water resources and therefore countries not being able to meet the demand, the water demand of their population as the main reason why countries will fight over water resources, especially these countries, obviously, that share water resources with their neighboring countries. However, Aaron Wolf from the Oregon State University produced this huge research analyzing the transboundary freshwater dispute database, which basically analyzed all the interactions between countries over water resources that happened in the past century and put them on a scale of conflict or cooperation. So there is a continuum, as you can see behind me in the slide. And so -7 means wars over water resources. +7 means unification into one nation. So you can see that, for instance, number 6, +6, means that countries have decided to sign an agreement over the shared water resources. And basically what he managed to prove and show through this research is that there have never been any war fought only over water resources, with water as the main reason for the war. However, most relations over water resources have been more of cooperation. As you can see, 438 are number 1, which is verbal support, a lot of number 4, so agreements, bilateral agreements, number 6, treaties. So there have been more instances of cooperation over water resources than conflicts over water resources. Homer Dixon, therefore, the academic that I mentioned earlier, admitted that water wars are very unlikely to happen, and only in a very small case the water wars might happen. And the conditions that he identified are if the downstream country, so the downstream country must be highly dependent on water for its national well-being. For instance, I would say probably the case of Egypt really relies on the Nile. Then the upstream country must be threatening to restrict substantially the river's flow, and that's what is happening with Ethiopia, planning to build and actually building the big dam, the Renaissance Dam on the Nile River, the Blue Nile River. And then there must be a history of antagonism between the two countries, which is not really much the case, I would say, between Ethiopia and Egypt. I mean, we could argue. But, and then finally, most importantly, the downstream country must believe it is militarily stronger than the upstream country, which probably was the case a few years ago for Egypt. But today, I mean, then there's also alliances that needs to be considered. So, however, others argued in the past decades that water can also bring countries to peace. So while the first narrative said, identified water scarcity as a risk, potential for water wars, this other narrative argues that actually water scarcity could be the reason why countries could come together and cooperate and therefore build peace through water. There's a few examples. There's also this example, which is very interesting, especially for the Middle East, which is often mentioned, of an NGO, EcoPeace Middle East, formerly known as Friends of the Earth Middle East, which is interesting because it brings together Israeli, Palestinians, and Jordanians, environmental activists, and therefore it's an NGO with 3 directors and 3 offices. However, it is often criticized, especially in the region, because it promotes normalization. So it is criticized from a political perspective because it shows that there is cooperation between these local communities, and this could be seen as greenwashing. So supporting the idea of we should cooperate and normalize the relations between these countries. However, from an environmental perspective, it is also argued by some that they are one of the few organizations in the region that are working to rehabilitate the lower Jordan River. So while the states are mainly focusing on the Dead Sea, which is decreasing by 1 meter per year, more or less, not many are calling for the restoration and rehabilitation of the lower Jordan River. Tony Allen, emeritus professor in King's College London, introduced the concept of virtual water. And Tony Allen basically explains why there have never been water wars in the Middle East. Well, he says that the Middle East, the MENA region, has already run out of water back in the 70s or in the 80s. However, countries managed to maintain political stability and ensure food security and water security to the population through the concept of virtual water, meaning the water embedded in the water needed to use to produce any good or service. So if we think of food, for instance, we have this diagram, and we can see, for instance, a burger. It's just a burger, but in order to produce a burger, so when we eat a burger, according to the virtual water concept, we are actually eating 2,500 liters of water, because we need water to produce the meat that is in the burger, we need water to produce the bread, and the same thing applies to any other kind of food. And so by importing, water-scarce countries, such many countries in the MENA region, managed to import virtual water and through food. So they imported a lot of food. In fact, for instance, Jordan imports 90% of the food that is consumed in the country, and in so doing, they are importing virtual water. And in this way, according to Tony Allen, countries did not have a reason to go for wars because they managed to import water through food products. So the literature of critical hydropolitics looks at conflict and cooperation. For instance, Mirumachi and Zeytoun argue that, so they criticize what Aaron Wolf was saying, basically that we can have a spectrum, a linear spectrum of either cooperation or conflict. And basically what they argue is that conflict and cooperation can actually coexist. Can actually coexist because We can have conflictual relations while having cooperative relations with any person or between countries. So it's not always either good relations, meaning cooperative relations if you want to, or conflictual relations. For instance, if we think of, the treaties on the Yarmouk River between Jordan and Syria. The last one was signed in 1987, and so we have a treaty which is seen as the best kind of cooperation between two countries, according to Aaron Wolf. However, that treaty is not respected by the Syrians. That's what Jordanians at least would argue. And therefore, it could be seen as one of the reasons why there are conflictual relations between the two countries. Or we have a slide. Yeah, this one is quite interesting. So in the case of the Oslo agreements, it's even more clear. We have an agreement between Palestine and Israel, where, however, the mountain aquifer partition gives 94% of the water to Israel and 6% to Palestine. So while we have an agreement or a treaty, which is seen by Aaron Wolf as the best kind of cooperation between two countries, what Mirumachi and Zeytoun would argue is that still the agreement could be seen as the reason why there's still conflictual relations. So the agreement does not solve the problem. So an agreement can either be not implemented or not respected by one of the two countries. Or another case is the 1959 agreement on the Nile Basin. So we have the Nile Basin agreement that gives 85% of the water to Egypt and 15% to Sudan. However, there's 11 countries. So, and today, the agreement is one of the reasons why there's still conflictual relations between the neighboring countries. I mean, the basin countries, the riparian countries. So who gets the water and how is the water allocated? So back to our question of hydropolitics, which tries to understand how the water is allocated within a basin. Some could argue, I mean, some people could think that, well, if we have a river, the countries that are upstream are the countries that get to decide how much water to use and how much water to let flow to the downstream countries. However, if we think of Egypt is the downstream country, still is the one that out of 11 countries uses most of the water resources of the Nile. So it's not enough to understand. Some other people could argue that maybe international water law can give us some principles to understand who gets the water. International water law, well, the main convention is the 1997 convention, so there is this convention on the non-navigational uses of international water courses. That gives us three important principles. The first one is no significant harm. The other one is prior notification, and then equitable and reasonable utilization. However, firstly, this convention is applicable only to the 36 countries that signed the convention, and we will see briefly which ones they are, firstly. And secondly, these principles are quite general, and therefore, even if there's some explanations on how can we interpret what is equitable and what is reasonable, still it's quite broad, and often this principle can be seen as contradictory to the first one. So in the case of the Nile, for instance, no significant harm is the principle that has been invoked by Egypt, because basically what they argue is that no significant harm means that the upstream countries cannot change the historical uses that have been done of the Nile. So Egypt has always been using most of the water resources, so by having Ethiopia building a dam, that would cause significant harm to Egypt. Equitable and reasonable utilization, instead, is often used by the countries that are using less water to try to renegotiate and try to get more water, because Ethiopia could argue, and is actually arguing, that having Egypt using most of the water resources of the Nile being shared by 11 countries, that's not equitable and it's not reasonable. However, that's principles, and it's not always easy to implement them. I mean, they're becoming customary law, but still it's not easy to implement them, especially if not all the countries of the basin, or the relevant countries of the basin, have not signed all of them this convention. Here is briefly you can see the convention. The one that I was mentioning is the blue one. And as you can see, the countries that are more, the hydrohegemon, meaning the countries that are more powerful in the basin, are those that actually did not sign, in most of the cases, the convention. So for instance, we can see that Israel did not sign it, Turkey did not sign it, and Egypt did not sign it, if you want to stay in this region. So it's difficult for other countries that share the same basin with these countries to convince these countries to adopt these principles. So, power. According to this critical hydropolitics literature, and in particular to Zaytoun and Warner, who developed this hydrohegemony framework, they tried to explain us how these water resources in shared basins are allocated. And so firstly I mentioned, and we can see it in the first pillar on the left, the riparian position, so whether the country is upstream or downstream. So they argue that it is easier for a country to have a dominant position if it's upstream. However, it's not always the case, because that's not only the only criteria, it's not the only pillar. As we said earlier, the case of Egypt and the case of also the case of Israel, both these countries are downstream to some extent, and therefore, however, they still have a powerful position within the basin and still use most of the water resources. The second one looks at power, and they say that power plays an important role in explaining who gets to decide and get most of the water resources. And for them, power is understood in the three dimension of Luke's, so the Luke's three dimension of power. So not only military power, so the first dimension of power is the military power, economic power. For instance, Israel has surely hard power, which is the first dimension of power. Egypt, surely before the revolutions and Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, used to surely have military and economic power. However, there's also two other dimensions of power that are very, very important. So the second one, so there's soft power, and there are, for instance, alliances, so alliances with other countries, but also bargaining power, so negotiation skills, availability of data, so especially when we discuss and they negotiate groundwater resources, which are the water resources of under the ground, right? So aquifers. It's very important to have data. For instance, that's what happened in 1993 in the Oslo negotiations. Israelis negotiators had a lot of availability of data about geology and other information, while Palestinians did not have a lot of data about what was under the ground. And that's, for instance, how they managed to obtain. That's an advantage during negotiations. And the last one is securitization and sanction discourses, meaning discursive power. So the power of shaping the discourses, of convincing other people of. So it's linked to hegemony, linked to, we'll see it better in this slide. So convincing, persuasion, influencing other people through narratives, through discourses, but that's something that we will see in detail during the second part of the presentation. And the third pillar is exploitation potential. So whether the country has enough infrastructure or the technological capacity or a number of engineers or population. So for instance, Laos versus China. Obviously China has a huge population, and therefore they can utilize easily the water resources of the Mekong River, while Laos, for instance, do not really. Or infrastructure. So does this country have the economic or engineering capacity to develop, to reach the groundwater resources and therefore to exploit the water resources, or to build a dam and exploit the water resources? So all these three pillars play a role in understanding and in explaining how can we understand who gets the water and how they can get the water. So yeah, that's basically what I was saying. if you use only material power, the interesting thing here, if you use only material power, is more about using force and therefore coercion. While if you manage to use also soft power together with hard power, it is about having both consent and coercion. So in that way, you can have a hegemonic role within the basin, which is the most powerful way to maintain the status quo and maintain your allocation of water also for the future years. Water scarcity. And now we are getting more into the second part of the presentation. So water scarcity is the lack of sufficient available water resources to meet the demands of water usage in a specific region or country. So meaning that your country does not have enough water to meet the demand. The supply is too low compared to the demand. And that's when you have a situation of water scarcity. There's both physical water scarcity or economic water scarcity. Economic water scarcity is basically if there are enough water resources but there is mismanagement, or if you are not able to exploit the water resources because you don't have the infrastructure or to exploit the water resources. While physical is if there's not enough water resources because of low precipitation or just because there's not much water resources. There's different indicators, many indicators. The most famous one and most used is the Falkenmark water stress indicator that basically says briefly that below 500 cubic meters per capita per year, that's a situation of extreme water scarcity, extreme water stress. And this is the situation of most countries in the region. This indicator has been, however, criticized for different reasons, including that it doesn't look at, so it looks at the average per year of water resources, but does not look at the differences in seasons. Or it does not consider the quality of the water resource. It just looks at how much water resources the country has, but not really the quality, or the variations within the country between different regions. So we might have a region in the country which is where it rains a lot and there's a lot of water resources. However, a large part of the country which that is very scarce, desertic, and that's something that is not captured by this indicator. For Leila Mehta, water scarcity, however, it is also about access and inclusion and exclusion. So we need to consider within a country, within a region that we are considering, who is actually getting the water. So within a city, for instance, which are the neighborhoods that are getting water, which ones are not. That's maybe more clear in some parts of the world, in some regions of the world than others. But for instance, clear examples are in the West Bank. In the West Bank, where we have the Israeli settlements, colonies that have a lot of availability of water, while Palestinian villages do not. Or some wells in India, where only some castes have access to, while women from certain castes do not, or South Africa during the apartheid period. So that's clear examples of water scarcity that is constructed due to institutionalized discrimination and policies of exclusion and inclusion. So the government or they decide who can have access to or who does not have access to. So, is there water scarcity in Lebanon, in Jordan, in the Middle East? There's different views. I've been asking this question to my students, and there's different views. But there are obviously numbers, so we have objective data. However, this data needs to be interpreted. So, in this slide, for instance, water scarcity in the Middle East. That's the total renewable water resources per inhabitant. And we can see that according to this map, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, most Gulf countries, Yemen are really water scarce, under 500 cubic meters. Lebanon is doing better than Jordan and other countries. Iraq is doing quite well. But is that enough to understand whether there is water scarcity? Because I'm sure if I asked people coming from certain countries that are blue, they would argue that actually there is water scarcity. And also in Lebanon, many people argued, and many of my students believe that there is water scarcity. Precipitations, that's another data that we can look at. And you can see that in Lebanon, it seems that it rains a lot compared to other, Oman, for instance. But also in Jordan, we can see that the western part of Jordan, the Jordan Valley is green compared to the rest of Jordan, and also in Saudi Arabia, the southern part towards Yemen is greener than other parts. So, but yeah, that's useful data, certainly, but we need to understand how to read this data. Also, it rains, but when does it rain? Does it rain only in specific months, maybe not in other months? And that's all data that we need to understand and make sense of. So discourses. Mehta and many others would argue that water scarcity is socially constructed, well, we will see briefly, but what many argue is that there is no truly objective way of seeing things, but we need to make sense of the objective reality through our own lenses. So through our disciplinary background, for instance, or experiences, we would read different issues in different ways. And discourses are central. Discourses are shared way of apprehending the world. So basically, if I say so we all understand what climate change is. And we all understand, so for instance, if I mention China, it's a country, some of us have been there, but we all have an idea of what China is. We know that it's a big country, we know that there's a lot of people living there, and all what we know is because, and that's a shared way of apprehending the case of China. And we know all what we know because we read it, we heard it, we might have been there, someone have maybe been there and told us about it, television, that's what we learned at school. And that basically constructs all together, all this information, a discourse of what China is in our eyes. And the same applies to everything. So for instance, and discourses are very, very important because according to how we understand a problem, then we can act on it to solve it. For instance, there's a small village in northern Jordan called Qais. It's a wonderful village. However, no one goes there. There's no tourism, not much, compared to Petra and other parts of the country. And if the mass media and everyone told us that that was the reason because of transportation, there's no direct transportation from the capital to Qais, then if we were the municipality of Qais, we would probably work and convince the government to build a better street, because that's the problem, that's how we understand the problem. However, if there was this discourse, but then the major and dominant discourse, meaning the discourse that manages to reach most of the people, therefore the one that convinces most people, argues that there's no tourism in Qais just because people don't know about it, so there's no marketing. Then probably we would focus on promoting Qais with good marketing. So according to how the dominant discourse frame the issue, then we will take, and it will open and shape towards certain solutions. And that's why it's very, very important to control or to contribute to frame discourses, because in this way we can contribute to shape towards solutions that we believe are best, either for us or for the society, according to who we are, I guess. So we will look at now at the case of Jordan. Jordan, we all know where it is, so I'm not going to mention it, but what is interesting about Jordan is that most of the surface water resources are shared with neighboring countries, and Jordan has also 3 agreements with neighboring countries on how to allocate the water resources. The 1987 agreement with Syria, bilateral agreement on the Yarmouk River, and then the 1994 agreement with Israel as part of the peace treaty, and recently the 2015 agreement with Saudi Arabia on the DC aquifer, which is a huge groundwater resource shared between the 2 countries. And so transboundary water resources are very, very important, also because most of the water resources in Jordan are surface water resources. However, as we can see here, most of the water supply in Jordan comes from groundwater resources. And that's why most of the groundwater resources are within the country, and therefore Jordan does not depend by bilateral agreements, but it's more free to use the groundwater resources because they are within the country. So 54% of the supply comes from groundwater resources, about 30% comes from surface water resources, and then 13% comes from treated wastewater, and that's a number that is actually increasing in the past years. Treated wastewater, meaning that they take the sewage, treated, so they take the wastewater, treat it, and reuse it. Mainly for irrigation of fruits and some agricultural crops. What is interesting in this slide is to look at who is actually using the water resources in Jordan and why. So that's a trend not only for Jordan, but generally for many other countries in the region, and we can see that almost 60% of the water in Jordan is used for agriculture. This number, for instance, was much higher in Syria. We had, I think, almost 90% of water used in agriculture. I'm not sure about Lebanon, but I believe it's also quite high, 65% in Lebanon. So that's a general trend in the region. Municipal and domestic use is 35% more or less, and industry, not much, 5%. However, what is interesting is that agriculture in Jordan accounts only for 3% of the national GDP. And labor is only 5%. Many of them are not even Jordanians. Historically, there were a lot of Egyptians working in the agricultural sector in Jordan. But the interesting thing is 90% or more of the food consumed in Jordan comes from abroad. So in Jordan, we have a situation where we are using a lot of water to produce food that is not consumed in the country. So it's not key for food security, at least. So back to the discourse of water scarcity. We will go back to the issue of agriculture in a bit. But back to the discourse. So I went to Jordan to understand how the discourse is constructed and whether there is water scarcity or not, and why, and what's the solutions. And so I tried to capture the water scarcity discourse, interviewing a lot of people, about almost 100. And so basically, I firstly analyzed what is written about this issue. So reports of the relevant ministries, of water and irrigation in particular, but also agriculture and other ministries, to see what they're saying about water scarcity. Is there water scarcity? If yes, why? What's the solutions? Then also reports of donors, organizations such as USAID, the GIZ, and JICA, and many others, United Nations, and also mass media. So what are the newspapers in Jordan saying about water scarcity? Do we have water scarcity? If yes, why? And what's the solutions? Statistical data, and an observation also of what was said by relevant ministers of water, senior officials, and so to understand what's the general discourse and perception and understanding of why we have water scarcity in Jordan. That's all media, diplomats, farmers as well. So I wanted to also talk to farmers to see what they thought about that, but also to tribes. I spent also a few weeks with Bedouins in the southern part of Jordan. Great experience. I went to Wadi Araba, Wadi Ram, and analyzed it with critical discourse analysis. Also, this slide is quite important. So I also analyzed the textbooks, because when I was speaking with the youth in Jordan, what they were telling me was that there is water scarcity, and I told them and asked them why there is water scarcity. And they say that there is water scarcity because that's what we studied at school. That's what they told us, our teachers. That's what is written in the textbooks. So I had the idea of just buying all the textbooks. Getting all the textbooks of primary, middle school, and high school in Jordan, and reading them all. That was quite a nice experience to analyze how the issue of water scarcity was framed. And I published an article last month about this, titled A Critique of Water Scarcity Discourses in Educational Policy and Textbooks in Jordan, where basically I analyzed how this issue was framed. And what was interesting was that while they mentioned all the reasons that we will see briefly, they emphasized on certain solutions. So in particular, the importance of building dams, and the importance of building the DC canal, so big infrastructure, in order to increase the supply and secure water for the country. However, also other solutions were mentioned, but not emphasized, such as the dams. The dams always had like a few pictures of dams, but then also other solutions such as saving water when having showers, gardening, and these kind of solutions. Back to this slide. So this slide is one of the main slides which shows what I found during all the interviews and this research. And what I found was that the discourse is divided into two big sub-discourses or narratives. The first one is the big one because it's more important. That's the dominant discourse. That's the one that you hear everywhere, and it's the big, important discourse that you will hear when an official from the Ministry of Water and Irrigation in Jordan speaks, or when you read the Jordan Times, which is quite of a mainstream journal in newspaper in the country. So that's, broadly speaking, the governmental aligned narrative, which basically argues that we have water scarcity because Jordan is obviously a water scarce country. We have physical water scarcity, and we have water scarcity for four main reasons. One is population growth. And basically what I'm saying is that everyone agrees with all the 7 reasons I'm going to mention, but the government emphasized these 4 reasons. And in particular, the first one, so population growth, immigration, and refugees. What it is argued is that we have water scarcity because the demand is increasing due to population. Jordan had a population of less than 500,000 when it became independent in 1946. And it increased, and it increased to arrive to 9.5, more or less, today, million people, which is quite a lot compared to 7 million in 2011. So population growth is quite of an important issue. Other one is the unfair sharing with neighboring countries. So either one, I mean, some people would say Syria is not respecting the treaty, and in fact, the Wahda Dam, which is the Unity Dam, a dam on the Yarmouk River, built Jordanians and Syrians, is quite empty. Now it's increasing a little bit, but it has been empty since it was, I mean, almost empty, maybe a tenth of its capacity. And so they're arguing that Syria is not respecting, so blaming the neighboring countries, either Syria or some others, but not really the high-level officials, but more either like the lower rank or not really from the government, blaming Israel for stealing our water or similar discourses. The other two are more, so these two are blaming either neighboring countries, so waves of refugees, or the neighboring countries. And the other two instead blame the nature, so nature, the environment, saying that climate change obviously is negatively impacting the water source in the country in different ways, lower precipitation, or decreasing precipitation, or recharge of the groundwater resources. So in different ways is having an impact, negative impact. The other one is aridity and low precipitation. So Jordan is in the Middle East, it's an arid country, it's normal that we don't have enough water, and that's why we have water scarcity. The other one instead it's mainly developed by NGOs, donors, the World Bank, IMF, so international organizations, NGOs, donors, and some academics as well. And what they emphasize so basically what they argue is that there is water scarcity. It is true that we have the 4 reasons that I just mentioned, but according to them, the issue is mainly due to mismanagement. So we have enough water resources, but they're not well managed. And that's seen especially in leakages and physical losses of water, so blaming the water utility, or blaming the illegal wells and the illegal uses in the country. Yeah, I mean, then like some other would argue that, well, if there is illegal wells, that's still water that's being used, but that's, yeah, but still, I mean, it is seen as part of non-revenue water, so water that, mismanaged, that's how it is seen. And the third one that is very, very important, which I was mentioning earlier, is the sustainable agricultural water use. So as I mentioned earlier, agriculture and water used in agriculture is 60%. However, it produces just 3% of the GDP. And therefore, basically what they argue and they're blaming is both the type of crops in the country, because it makes no sense for these people to see bananas or tomatoes or watermelons grown in the country. And then often these kind of crops are exported to the Gulf countries or other countries. And therefore, Jordan is exporting virtual water, and that's seen as not a wise policy from a water perspective, at least. And then the efficiency of water in agriculture. And that's targeting mainly one part of the country, so not the Jordan Valley, where the irrigation system is quite advanced, and many projects have been done. There's also the Water Users Association that is helping in better managing the water resources in the Jordan Valley. But it mainly targets the highlands, so the northern part of the countries where agriculture uses mainly groundwater resources, and it's usually big agribusinesses, large farmers that are overexploiting groundwater resources. And that's where usually they see the unsustainable use of water in agriculture. So yeah, what are the solutions that are opened by? Yes, what are the solutions opened by these two different sub-discourses? The first one, the governmental one, that blame that we don't have enough water resources because. And therefore, well, we have limited water resources, that's why we have water scarcity. The natural solutions for them is to focus on the supply. So we don't have enough water resources, we need to increase the supply. And we need to increase the supply by building building the Red Dead Canal, which is seen as a strategic project for the country, which basically is, for who is not familiar with the Red Dead Canal, it's a project that would desalinize water in Aqaba, meaning of the Red Sea, and then pump some water, the brines, in the Dead Sea, and that in theory would solve partly the decrease of the level of the Dead Sea. And then it would be a water swap agreement with Israel. So Jordan would sell this water to Israel in Aqaba, to Eilat, so in the southern part of the two countries, and then Israel would give water to Jordan from Tabaria, so Tiberid Lake in the north, to the northern part of the country, which is where Jordan needs more water, because that's where the big cities are, because Aqaba is 300 kilometers south from Amman, and then we have Irbid in the north. And then Israel would also sell some water to Palestine. So that's what the Red Dead Canal is. And the main country and government pushing for it is Jordan, because they see it as a key project to secure water for the country. Other supply side solutions are the DC project, which is bringing water from the DC aquifer in the southern part of the country, pumped north to the big cities of Jordan, and then building dams, claiming and trying to renegotiate some of the transboundary agreements, especially with Syria, maybe with Israel, and they just signed the agreement with Saudi Arabia, so it's quite successful from this perspective. However, the other smaller discourse of the donors that I was mentioning, who sees in mismanagement the main reason for water scarcity, the obvious solution for them, opened by this sub-discourse, is more efficiency. We need more efficiency, better management of the existing water resources. So water utilities, which have been blamed for no-revenue water, need to be privatized or to incorporate some market mentality in how we run these water utilities, close the illegal wells, and very importantly, and that's something that has been a matter of conflict in Jordan, is the tariffing system and subsidies removal for water in agricultural sector, because something that I did not mention earlier is that water for agriculture is water in agriculture is very, very cheap compared to the water for domestic use. It's almost free, And that's why, I mean, and these people who argue that by increasing the tariffs, we could push farmers to better manage the water resources, and then also regulations on the type of crops. However, and then like awareness raising campaigns, but that's something that everyone supports because it's nice and donors will pay for it. But what is key here is to see this this paradigm on agriculture and the challenges for the government to pass such reforms. So yes, this slide is one of the slides, and basically, from a water perspective, the natural solution would be less water for irrigation because we're using too much water, and cut the subsidies in agriculture. However, that's from a water perspective, and that's not enough because a government obviously cannot only run the country looking at water. It has also to look at the broader issues in the country, labor market, rural development, and so agriculture still, it's important from a rural development perspective. It is important also, I mean, for a cultural perspective, so from a political ecology approach, agriculture and rural development are very, very key. And then something important is we need to think who are these farmers. And in Jordan, large farmers usually are powerful people that have either economic power in the country, so businessmen, or tribal influence, and usually these people are also well connected in the parliament, in the ministries, and therefore that will be quite challenging for a government to pass reforms taking off the subsidies for agriculture, or deciding what kind of crops they can or cannot have in their farms because of this political economy that I was mentioning, the power relations within the country. Some people would, have described it as the shadow state in the country. So power relations within the country, and especially today, but I mean, this has been anyway the case for the past decades and decades and decades. In order to maintain the political stability in the country, it's important to secure the support for Jordan of certain groups which are very influential, including these large farmers. And that's why those are issues that need to be considered when deciding what to do in the water sector. And therefore, what I'm saying is that we cannot only think of the water sector per se, but we need to situate it within the broader, this broader political context of political economy in the country. So I'm about to finish, so the last point here is the necessity of considering also the water, energy, food interplay and nexus, because as I was saying, we need to consider water and food together because it makes no sense to consider only water without looking at food. And I'm happy to see many people from the food security group here. And the interplay also with energy, because I was mentioning the Red Dead Canal needs, and desalinization in general, uses a lot of energy to desalinize, but also in the country, in Jordan, to pump water. I think 25–30% of the electricity and energy in Jordan is used by the Ministry of Water to pump water around the country, because the DC Canal is 300 kilometers long, and we need to pump water from the Red Sea to Amman and to Irbid. So those are all things that we need to consider when discussing water, and therefore it's easy probably to suggest some water policies, and I'm sure Nadim would agree with me because I know that also IFI here we are working on the water, energy, food interplay and nexus. We need to consider water within the interplay with these other sectors. Last point. So yeah, another question that it's quite interesting that I was looking at in the past was whether the water scarcity discourse impacts transboundary water governance. What I concluded by looking at the relations between Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, and Jordan, Syria, is that water is important, but it's only one, and water scarcity is important as a discourse, but it's only one out of other elements that needs to be considered, because it needs to be situated within, as we were saying, geopolitical relations, etc., etc. So it's not enough to look only at water scarcity discourse to understand the transboundary water governance and the transboundary relations. These slides shows only the future research that I'm already working on and gonna work on in the future, which are quite linked to what I was saying. Either, mainly with IFI and with Nadim's team. So the role of the new discourses of refugees and population growth and climate change in shaping water policies in the region. New and old national water strategies in Jordan and Lebanon. What is changing in these national water strategies and why are they changing in that specific ways? And then the political economy of water scarcity in the Middle East, looking at some specific countries to understand patterns in different countries. And then a critical approach, water of the nexus of water, energy, food. And finally, as he was mentioning, a critical approach to the concept of water diplomacy, which is important when we talk of transboundary water governance. But the question is, what is water diplomacy, and what new can this concept bring to the table? So yeah, thank you for your attention. I hope it was useful to introduce you to some of the concepts. And I'm looking forward to a dialogue and conversation with you and with the many experts in the room on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. We will want to give the floor to questions, and I would please ask people to limit their brief questions, not an intervention and a whole speech. We just need to give, there are about 50 people in here, and we'd like a question to be asked and then come back. Dr. Urtas and then Dr. Ali. We'll take 3 questions, answers, and then other 3 questions.
My first question is related to water pollution and water use in agriculture. So the problem is not the scarcity of land as it is scarcity of water good for agriculture. Here in Lebanon, unfortunately, despite the fact that Lebanon is considered among the other countries of the Near East, of the MENA region, as one of the best countries in richness of water, but there is a degradation, especially in the quality of water, especially for underground water. And here, to what extent saline water could you use for agriculture? Because we know in the Gulf states, mainly, they are using water which is taken from the sea in order to be used in agriculture. My second question is related to water management. Water management at all levels for irrigation, at the top level, the medium level, and at the farm level even. Here we have a big problems at all levels here in Lebanon. Finally, the big problem is the power structure in agriculture policy, for policy making. To what extent we are giving priority to agriculture? To what extent pressure groups in the country are doing very good work in agriculture policy as a pressure group? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hassan, for an excellent talk. I will comply with the name by not making an intervention, but since we work in the same place, we can meet later to discuss. So my questions, something very interesting. In one of your slides, it was clear that more than 50% of supply in Jordan comes from underground water. And recently there has been a talk in Jordan about shale oil, big time, like as one of the perhaps next big things in the kingdom. Have you heard or witnessed any discussion on the impact of exploiting shale oil and gas in Jordan and the underground water. I mean, it affects underground not only because of fracking and other things, but also the process itself takes a lot of water. My second brief question, also very interestingly, the groundwater agreement you mentioned between Saudi Arabia and Jordan. So what was the mechanism? I mean, do we have like a certain law that applies to these resources, or does it happen based on bilateral agreements?
Thank you.
Sammy from the Nature Conservation Center. Thank you so much for the enlightening talk. So my question is in regard to water stress indicators and indices that we use. Yeah, my question is in regard to the water stress indices that we use. So obviously a lot of institutions and groups of academics have worked on this, and for good reason. But still, like you mentioned with the Falkenmark method, it's quite restricted in its scope, while others, such as the Water Poverty Index, is quite macro. So I'm wondering, when it comes to international court and these different countries adjudicating on who's going to get water allocations, which of these indices ends up holding up in court, and do we allow these ones that are more comprehensive to have a stamp?
Okay. We will answer these to the gentleman first, and then we move on.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for all your questions. So I'll try to answer some of them. I'm sure others in the room can jump in and help me on some others. So the first questions, very interesting. Water management, I completely agree that can be on different levels, both at the community level, national level, regional level. And it is important indeed to act on all these levels in order to maximize the good management in all levels. And when it comes to groundwater resources and salinity, that's quite important also for Jordan, because and many countries in the region, because the tendency is to overexploit the water resources in order to maintain, to secure water for the increasing demand. However, overexploitation of the groundwater resources results in increased salinity and deterioration of the groundwater resource. And so it is not best practice. However, like in Jordan, we have some large farmers that are desalinizing treating these groundwater resources with the high salinity in order to try to use it again in their farms. Power structure in agriculture. Yes, that's very important. So the pressure groups in the agricultural sector in Lebanon, and which sector should we prioritize? And as you say, the agricultural lobbyists or pressure groups are very, very important here as well as in Jordan. However, what we have in Jordan is the National Water Strategy. And the declaration of the King of Jordan, who said that the priority should go to domestic users. So he gave a priority, domestic users first, agriculture second, and industry third. And in this way, we have a framework that, given that comes from the king, it cannot be challenged. So the priority goes to domestic users. And that links us to the question on the DC, which the DC aquifer used to be highly exploited by both countries for agricultural uses and farms in the southern part of Jordan and northern part of Saudi Arabia. However, through this agreement, they both agreed that the water from the DC, which for the geologist is a non-renewable fossil groundwater aquifer, right? There's a few geologists. What has been decided is that we cannot use this water for agriculture, but can only be used for domestic uses, and that's why they closed the wells of farms in the southern part of Jordan, and supposedly also Saudi Arabia has done so. Your other question on the shale oil, exploitation of shale, I'm not sure. I mean, I read in the Jordan Times, but I'm not sure if maybe someone else from Jordan here wants, well, Nadim, and also, I see Dr.
There are two technologies to extract oil from the oil shales. The first one is the surface retorting, and this is not affecting the oil shales at all. The second one, which is created by Shell, which is called the ICB. This is to extract the oil from the deep layers, but the concession area of Shell reduced from 22,000 square kilometers to 2,000 only, just to avoid this issue. So it will not affect us at all.
Just to answer Ahmed Andam, involved in a discussion with the Shell CEO in Jordan, and it seems that their concession is not restricted. In some, they're using heat, injecting heat to extract oil using solar panels and other renewable sources. So there is that exchange, but still the use of water is going to be problematic, and it is already now being challenged by NGOs and the civil society in Jordan to a limited extent. The king says we do, but this is in Jordan. However, one point, if I may, in reference to Dr. Altas's mention of the power structure in agriculture, well, this is what we're working on in terms of the nexus. We just don't look at one aspect and look at it as a silo approach, agriculture alone, or food production alone, water production, or water management, or energy. It is an integrated approach that is being proposed, and we're promoting, and we're pushing forward, because it takes into consideration every other key element for development, so that when you ever develop a strategy, a water strategy, or an agricultural strategy, or your energy strategy, it is not water, energy, or food centric. It is an integrated strategy.
Thank you. I think I just forgot one question.
Yes, the indices.
The indices, right? Yeah, and what is considered in International Court of Justice, I guess. Well, I mean, the International Court of Justice focuses more on, not really on these indicators, but more on the International Water Conventions. So more on the principles that I was mentioning earlier.
For example, you said equitable utilization.
Yes, yeah.
So to really get at that, I mean, if you're going to put a per capita kind of thing on it, or try and determine water stress for that country, I think it is relevant to their case.
Yeah, it is one of many elements that is considered.
Right. Of course,
yeah.
Of course. But I would just hope that these more comprehensive ones, as Dr. Jalal was mentioning, these integrated ones are given a stand, are taken seriously, even though these more entrenched ones, like the Falcon method, this is the established one, but still we have ones that are better that are emerging now. So
yeah, I agree. I'm not sure about which. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm not sure which ones are. I mean, my understanding is that usually they adopt the Falcon Marks one, also the ICJ, but there might be cases where also other indexes were used. I'm not sure if anyone has an idea about, but I can follow up on that and let you know later.
Another round of questions?
Thank you for the presentation. I'm not an expert at it. But I'm curious to know if there is a kind of regional setup or platform or anything that promote or that works on diplomacy, who could be in the best practices, who could be involved in such processes. Is it like you mentioned a bit the role of or the issue of data, the availability of data and the negotiation, and then an NGO in Jordan who was working a bit on this topic. So who are the main actors when we talk on, you know, like either diplomacy, negotiation, agreements, etc. I'm asking about the region, the Middle East region.
You had a question? No? Any other question? Philip? Yes, thank you.
I find your connection with the discourse quite interesting when you say that the approach to the discourse on water impacts proposed solutions. What would be your assessment of what is the current discourse on the availability of fresh water resources in Lebanon?
There was another question down the row. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, because you touched on it a little bit about agriculture, and I was wondering if in your research you've heard about any willingness from countries like Egypt who use very water-intensive crops, you know, for some of their biggest agriculture exports and industries, if there's a willingness from any of these countries to use, I guess, more suitable crops given the water levels that they have, which is not just the case for the Middle East, but it seems like it's the case all over the world where there are some very dry climates that are using very water-intensive crops.
Okay.
Great. So best practices with regard in region on hydro diplomacy. Well, on hydro diplomacy trainings and these kind of issues, I would say there's many organizations and donors that are pushing and promoting trainings in the region for governmental personnel on water diplomacy to teach them, train them on what they perceive as good practices. And for instance, the Swedish are very involved in this, from the Swedish Institute to the Stockholm International Water Institute. They are very, and SIDA as well, they are promoting a lot of these kind of trainings. UNESCO as well, they just promoted one other training. So these kind of organizations, I guess also the Arab League, they are trying to bring together either water experts from the relevant ministries or diplomats working on water issues together to train them on how to negotiate win-win solutions and this kind of best practices. One best practice in general that is mentioned is benefit sharing. So when two countries manage to come together and negotiate an agreement by trying to increase the pie, and therefore a win-win solution where, for instance, if one country needs to build a dam for electricity, and the other country doesn't want that dam because wants to use the water for agriculture, then they could decide to build a dam in one specific position, and one country gets the electricity and the other one gets the water for agriculture. So this kind of best practices and benefit sharing. And then another one is to look at percentages when you write an agreement and not at absolute numbers. So you would not probably write that, and that's something that the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan was criticized, because it gives absolute numbers where Jordan has to give a certain amount of water from the Yarmouk 20 MCM, if I'm not wrong, to Israel. While it would have been better to say 5% of the flow, because as we know, climate change and other issues could decrease the flow of the river. So you never know how future, and so it will be, and therefore it's better to have it quite flexible, and percentages are a good way to ensure this. Other question. Water availability in Lebanon, what's the discourse? What's my perception of the discourse here? My understanding, I've been here only for 3 months, I'm not from Lebanon, but like my understanding so far is that there are issues of water scarcity in Lebanon, and the reason is that even if it rains a lot, we don't manage to capture all the water, and therefore the solution that this discourse opens is that we need to better capture the water that comes through building dams. Well, maybe Nadim can give his perspective, but that's my understanding so far from.
We know Nadim's perspective.
But that's more or less my perspective. But that's something that I'm starting to read about, and I will research more in the second semester. Water-intensive crops, Egypt, etc. Yeah, I mean, it's very linked to the international trade market, international political economy, linkages between like historical, also like domination, colonies. It's quite complicated, but I mean, in Jordan, for instance, what has been happening is to try to support farmers through, for instance, the Water User Association and other kind of projects in the Jordan Valley, to try to switch to different crops, such as dates, which make more sense for a region such as the Middle East, because I mean, that's the natural habitat for dates, firstly, and secondly, because they use less water, and still you can sell them at a better price than tomatoes. But still, I mean, it depends on many trade agreements, and so it's not easy. But that's something that I completely agree with you. We should work on and try to push for.
I need to intervene just
Yes.
To respond to that and inform others. On your question, who is doing what in terms of bringing up some kind of a dialogue? We at this institute and through our program here, we've been involved in a policy dialogue between Lebanon, involving Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and Iraq, the Levant. We couldn't include Syria, unfortunately, because of the current state of warfare there. But we have been discussing over the past 6 months through 2 meetings, and then there's a third coming up. High-level people, Director General people, and close to ministers' advisors, looking at the water, energy, food nexus and how to push forward policies that help coordination within the region, the Levant region, let's say. And what are the obstacles and their perception on how to move forward and overcome these obstacles, and what needs to be done on a local level to address this kind of an approach that's more integrated, that lends itself to be more responsive to different scarcity issues. So that's one plug for us. And regarding water-intensive crops, one thing that I don't know if you all are aware, in the Ghor Valley, in the Jordan Valley, they're moving into growing bananas, which is, you know, there's another swing, but the main reason for that, it's a good cash crop. So as long as there is this monetary incentive, financial incentive, then people are going to waste water. In my opinion, it's a waste. And if there is not a appropriate tariff on how much water you use, and there is a control in terms of paying for the water that you're using and the outcome of that, then we will always be wasting water in that sense. Any more questions? 1, 2, any more? And this is the last round, so we don't want to keep people longer. Okay, go ahead, please.
As we see in Syria now, as we see in Syria now, the situation is clearing up, and there are efforts to begin rebuilding Syria after the war. Can that provide some leverage to better, leverage to better process some part of the water which is shared with Jordan, or perhaps with Saudi Arabia for the Nayon project, which is also industrial and provides leverage to better share or get a better share of the water shared with Jordan?
Two questions and a comment related to a question that was raised earlier. I mean, I'm working on my thesis that's related to water, and to my understanding in Lebanon, one of the problems is that the water supply is so fragmented. So just a supply-ended solution does not really quite meet many of the problems. And I was curious actually in Jordan if the supply is really centralized, where it's entirely run by the governments. That was my first question. Also, the national water sector strategy in Lebanon works very much within the framework of neoliberalization of water, privatization, large projects, such as you mentioned, dams, which is here, where I'm going to have to slightly disagree with you on, in response to the question that was raised earlier, already placing the answer within that. There's water scarcity, the solution is dam. I mean, that's exactly the point you just made about discourses and how they can shape the problem and how we answer it. So I would say it's a little bit too conclusive, I mean, from my point of view of what I know so far. And so I also wanted to, going back to the neoliberalization part, is it the same in Jordan? So the water and national water sector strategy, is it working within the same frameworks of neoliberalization, or how does it work?
Thank you. Great. Now Syria, war, relations with Jordan, etc. So what we are starting to see in Jordan is that the Wahda Dam that I was mentioning earlier, which has a capacity of 100 MCM 100 MCM, and has had only 20% filled in. Since 2012, started to see an increase to about 45%, which is a good thing for Jordan. But still, I mean, we need to understand why. Why is this happening? It's not because Syria decided to finally respect the agreement, but because different things that are going on in Syria, including there's electricity cuts, and therefore they cannot operate the dams, the small dams that they built upstream, and that's why the water just flows downstream towards Jordan and towards the Wahda Dam. That's one reason. Second reason is that they cannot pump the water towards the farms that they have in Syria, and therefore there's less agriculture activities, farming activities, and that plays in favor of Jordan because this water goes into the Wahda Dam. Post-Syria, bilateral relations, well, I mean, it depends how Syria is going to look like, but probably as per Egypt, I mean, Egypt is starting to have less power versus Ethiopia after 2011-12. And that's also probably likely to happen Syria versus Jordan. I mean, I don't know. I mean, now Syria, I mean, historically Syria has been more powerful than Jordan, but we don't know in the future how it will look like. So it's more likely that Jordan will gain a little bit of power versus Syria. Would this result in a renegotiation of the agreement? Jordan probably hopes so, but I mean, that's too early to say. Depends how Syria and the future government will look like and the broader relations between the two countries. Other question, water supply sector in Jordan, how does it look like, segmented or not? Well, it's quite, I mean, historically it's been quite centralized. In the past years, there's like a PPP, so like a private-public partnership, so it's private but public, so a bit yes but no, right? So it's both, right? And yeah, I mean, it's centralized at the governorate level, so we have the Miahuna in Amman governorate, which, I mean, its CEO is nominated by the government, so it sits within the ministry, so it's a bit complicated. But yeah, it's more, I mean, it's both public and private. And for the northern part of the country, there's mainly Yarmouk River Company, Yarmouk Water Company, and Aqaba Water Company in the governorate of Aqaba. So it's centralized at the governorate level, I would say. But then they all respond to the central ministry of water. So it's, I mean, I don't know how, I mean, you mentioned that here it's very, very segmented, and I mean, it seems that Jordan is doing better than Lebanon, but I'm not very familiar with Lebanon yet.
Who says centralized is good?
No, but it's not. No, but super segmented might not be good either, right? And then water strategy in Lebanon, neoliberalism, etc. Well, in Jordan, to some extent, the path was quite going towards a neoliberal reforms, especially after the IMF loans in 1989 and 2001, I think. However, at the same time, it's not at the same time, because like there's a lot of reforms that in theory should have happened if Jordan was going in that path, but that did not happen, such as removal of subsidies for the agricultural water sector, which did not happen. So, and also the privatization that they were pushing for did not really happen, because this water company is still more public than private. So probably the idea was to go in that path, but it did not, because of all this broader political situation context that I was mentioning earlier. Concerning dams, I just tried to simplify it, but I mean, obviously dams are a solution that is emphasized, but then it is together with other solutions of better management, etc., that needs to be water demand management, etc., that needs to be adopted. But at least for Jordan, the emphasis is more on infrastructural, hydraulic development, but still it lies together with awareness-raising campaigns, etc. So my understanding here is that still the emphasis is going towards more dams, but I'm sure that they're also combining them with some water demand management, awareness-raising, etc., type of campaigns. But maybe, I mean, Nadim, I'm sure is very familiar with the strategies, so maybe you want to say something on that?
Oh, we'll keep it later if you want to on a sidebar. Okay, so thank you very much, Hussam, for this most interesting presentation. Thank you all for sticking with us late into the evening and for being here through this dire weather that we have. And I hope we will engage with you with some more discussions, maybe more detailed discussions, more focused discussions on part of these topics. We're more than happy to hear from you. If you want more issues to discuss with us, we'd be more than happy to host and further this. It is a pleasure for us to have you here. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Hussam. Thank you.